Dr. George Webster is taking our next paper. Dr. Webster is lecturer in philosophy at Keble College, University of Oxford. His research interests include European philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics of science, and process philosophy. And he's published on the philosophers Hegel and Deleuze. And his paper is Naturalistic Alternatives to Religious Ethics. Enjoy.
Great. Awesome. So thank you so much, Luke, for inviting me, for having me. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited about this. So, yeah, as my title indicates, I'm going to talk today about naturalistic alternatives to religious ethics. And to be a bit more precise, I'm really going to be talking about realist naturalistic alternatives to religious ethics. And I'll say a bit more in a moment about what these technical terms, realism, naturalism, mean. But really, I want to start by asking you a few questions. So I always get really excited when you get a bunch of, large number of students in the room, because it gives me a good sample size to test students' intuitions. And before I do a bit of technological faff and switch to another screen, I guess I want to underline something. So, you're here because you either sort of already study philosophy or you're interested in philosophical and sort of religious studies ideas, and you're probably quite used to sort of high-level theoretical, critical thinking about these issues. Right now, I'm not interested in that. What I want is your sort of gut reaction to my questions, your intuitive response. So don't second-guess yourselves, be honest with yourselves and with us. So, with that said, let me see if I can seamlessly switch to this thing. And what I'm interested in asking you is whether you agree or disagree with the following statement. So, some actions are right or wrong, irrespective of the time, place, or culture in which they are done. What do you think? And again, what's your gut reaction, your intuition? Oh, I'll add as well, this is completely anonymous. None of this data is sort of being, it doesn't know your names or your IP addresses or whatever. It's just the raw percentages. Cool, so it seems as though we're landing on most people agreeing with this notion that some things are just right or wrong, full stop, right? Independent of where you are or what period in history you are, or that sort of thing. Some people are still deciding, that's okay. It's funny actually, because a lot of the students that I teach when they come first year undergraduate, a lot of them tend to be a bit more sort of relativistic about morality, shall we say. It's always a bit disconcerting to me, so this is quite nice. Right, and now I want to ask you a second question, and I want to see how the answers to these two questions interact. So I'm going to stop access to this question, go on to the next one, and I want to ask, do you have any religious beliefs? Again, this is completely anonymous, don't worry about sort of being identified, but obviously the topic of this workshop, the theme of this workshop is religious ethics, morality and God. And I want to find out how our responses to the second question interact with our responses to the first question. Okay, so like Adrian sort of indicated earlier, we've got a spread of belief here. And what I want to do now, I believe, if I can stop that, we can do a bit of cross-sectional analysis to see how those responses interact with one another. And it seems as though, how do I read this? I'm a philosopher, I'm not a statistician, but so is it fair to say that most people who have religious beliefs agree with, a lot of people who have religious beliefs, it looks like, agree with the statement, right? Am I reading that correctly? Do you think? Yeah, okay. So we might say there's a correlation between people having sort of religious beliefs, having some sort of religious commitment or spiritual commitment, and thinking that some things are just right or wrong, full stop, irrespective of time, place, culture. And that's sort of what I was betting on happening, really. So I'm happy it looks like it turns out that way. Right, so now I'm going to switch back to my... Okay, seamless. Where did I put my thing? So, in case you haven't sort of figured out already, that first statement, some things are just right or wrong, irrespective of time, place, or culture, is a statement of a philosophical view called moral realism, which can be expressed otherwise as the view that there are objective moral facts. And objective is a bit of a tricky word. By objective here, I just mean independent of what any individual or culture or community or society thinks, right? So the idea is that some actions, some things are just right or wrong, and what makes them right or wrong is the world, right? Not us, not what we decide, not cultural norms, not that. And there are actually plenty of good sort of intuitive reasons to be a moral realist. So one of those is you have a lot of convergence of moral belief across the world, right? So much like with science, you might have a physics experiment take place over here in this country, and you might have a physics experiment take place over here in this country. And if they're doing the same experiment, and if they're doing that experiment properly, they're likely to get the same result, right? And we say that they get the same result because that's the way the world is. They figured out something about the way the world is. And similarly, a lot of people across the world share certain basic moral beliefs. And so moral realism, just the idea that there are moral facts in the world, is a nice explanation of that phenomenon. And that phenomenon provides some evidence for moral realism, the realist is going to want to say. Similarly, it's plausible to think that through the course of human history, there's been at least some moral progress, right? We're better off than we were 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 20 years ago, right? We live in a fairer, more just society, you might say. And the idea that there are facts and that we've managed to tack on to or track more of those facts like now than we did previously nicely explains that phenomenon as well, makes sense of that thought. We disagree, right? We're having moral disagreements all the time. That's just what the news is, in a way. And often a way, an intuitive way to make sense of disagreement is, when we disagree about something, there are facts that we're disagreeing about, right? When we have a disagreement, we tend to think that at least one of us is wrong. So again, moral realism makes sense of the widespread phenomenon of the fact that we argue with each other all the time about what's right and wrong. In direct opposition to what Adrian was saying in his talk, moral language seems factual, right? At least at the sort of surface grammatical level. So a lot of our moral statements sort of take the form, stealing without good reason is wrong, right? Bullying is wrong. And grammatically, those sentences are very similar to sentences like, there is a black hole at the center of the universe. Grass is green. So on the face of it, a lot of our moral language is fact-presenting. It seems as though when I say something like bullying is wrong, I'm attributing a property to events or states of affairs such as bullying, the property of wrongness. Just like if I say that the grass is green, I'm attributing a property in the world to grass. And finally, but perhaps most importantly, and I think you've sort of shown this in your response to the first sort of poll question, we have these very, very, especially if we're honest with ourselves, we have these very deep moral convictions, right? There are some things that we just think are so evil and so morally abhorrent that we just can't entertain the notion of there being any circumstances in which they might be permitted, thought of as permissible, right? And moral realism makes sense of this conviction and sort of justifies the occurrence of these convictions. So there are sort of plenty of sort of intuitive reasons to think that something like moral realism is attractive. But a problem facing anyone who wants to be a moral realist is that, so a problem facing anyone who thinks that there are such things as objective moral facts, is that you've got to explain where those facts are and where those facts come from, right? And why they are the facts that they are. And that's where religious commitment often comes in, right? So systems of religious belief tend to provide precisely this sort of story. I mean, first of all, right, a lot of religions are based on systems of moral belief that their advocates take to be like factual, right? Sets of moral beliefs that are quite literally set in stone. And second, you get a story about why those beliefs are objective facts, right? In the case of Christianity, there is an all-powerful God. That God is all good, omnibenevolent. And that God's will is expressed in these 10 Commandments or whatever. And whatever that God wills or wants us to think of as the right thing to do is the moral objective truth, or something like that. Ooh. And so we should be able to see how moral realism and religious commitment go quite nicely together, right? And this, I suppose, sort of makes sense of that correlation we observed earlier at the start, right? You might think they're a match made in heaven. And relatedly, you might think that if you're already convinced that appeal to some godlike figure or to some higher power is the best or the only way to make sense of objective moral facts, and if you think there are objective moral facts, you're going to find the idea of religious commitment quite attractive. And the inverse of this is true as well, right? So if you're, from the outset, a committed atheist, and if you also think that the only way to make sense of objective moral facts is by appeal to some higher power outside of the veil of our world, then you're going to be disinclined to get on board with something like moral realism. But if you can identify a sort of viable naturalistic alternative, right, a sort of alternative logical space, then you can make the sort of atheistic worldview that Adrian was talking about in his paper, you can sort of increase the capacity and attractiveness of that view, right? And at the same time, I suppose you can undermine at least some motivation for religious belief. This isn't to say that identifying some naturalistic alternative to religious moral realism undermines, is a complete refutation of religious belief or anything like that. But it does seem as though it undermines at least some of the reason for adopting religious belief. And that's sort of the stakes in these ideas here, right? And yeah, that's what's at stake here. So what I'm wanting to do today is just to explore what a non-religious account of moral realism might look like. And I want to give you a snapshot of the kind of thinking around these ideas. And so what I'm going to do is sort of run through very briefly how perhaps we should and shouldn't think of a version of moral naturalism, of naturalistic moral realism. We're going to talk about a test for deciding whether something like moral naturalism is the right way to go. And then we're going to think a bit more critically and in detail about how we go about applying that test. Okay. So I've been bandying around the term naturalism quite a lot, naturalistic alternatives to religious ethics. What on earth does that mean? Well, a moral view that is a naturalistic alternative to religious ethics conforms to a sort of more general philosophical view called naturalism, right? And that's just the view that everything that exists is part of nature, and we understand nature, and therefore anything that exists through science or through scientific means. So whenever you hear the word naturalism or naturalistic, you can just think scientific if you like. So to make this explicit, for someone who's a committed philosophical naturalist, there are no divine higher powers that you can refer to make sense of objective moral facts. There's nothing outside of our world, outside of nature. Everything is natural, everything is amenable to something like scientific investigation. And so a version of moral realism that conforms to this view is just we can define it just as basically by smashing our definitions of moral realism and naturalism together. So it's just going to be the view that there are objective moral facts, that those facts are part of nature, and that we understand those facts through scientific means. So there are objective moral facts, they're part of nature, and we understand them through broadly scientific means. And you might think this is where you hit the first stumbling block for this sort of view, right? Because one question you might have immediately is, where on earth are these objective moral facts, right? What domain of science is investigating these facts? Who's discovering them and finding them and talking about them, right? Are we discovering moral facts at the bottom of a test tube? Are we discovering them at the bottom of some archaeological dig? Right? Is that where the moral facts are? Or has some ancient scholar already discovered them and we need to sort of find them in some sort of archive or in a dusty tome like Adrian's big book, you know? So this worry is actually based on a minor confusion. And it's based on a minor confusion about how we understand the way science works and what we mean by scientific means here. And to sort of see, and what is that confusion? Well, the confusion here is that scientific inquiry, or all the objects of scientific inquiry, are things that are very sort of tangible and that we can observe directly, right? Again, my sort of like questions to the moral naturalist were like, where am I seeing these moral facts, right? Where are the sort of physical, tangible objects? But of course, that's not how a lot of scientific inquiry works. And to sort of see that that's the case, we can, for an example of this, we can look at this illustration that I've got, and of course that isn't working, so I'm going to have to come out of here and go do my little Yeah. Okay. So this is a physics experiment called a cloud chamber. And it's basically a fish tank and the air is sealed up. The air in it is super saturated with a kind of alcohol vapor, such that the air inside it is sort of right on the edge of condensing into water droplets. And what this person's done is they've put a bit of radioactive material into the tank, right? This is a rod of thorium. And when you do this, you start to see all these little streaks appear, these little tiny vapor trails. And what the physicist is going to say, I wish I had access to my mouse. Oh, there we go. So the physicist is going to tell you that these vapor trails appear because they're caused by what they call alpha particles being emitted as part of a radioactive decay of thorium. An alpha particle is basically 2 neutrons and 2 protons stuck together. So what's happening is that these alpha particles, they're being emitted by the radioactive decay. They're transferring some of their energy as they whiz away to the air around them, and that energy is pushing the supersaturated air sort of over the edge. It condenses into water droplets, leaves this vapor trail, and that sort of rains away as the particle moves on. And it's quite sort of just hypnotic to watch in a way, right? So physicists and sort of, I guess we generally in our sort of cultural scientific consciousness, we think alpha particles exist, but we can't see them, right? We can't observe them, we can't touch them or hear them or bump into them. We have to infer their existence from the presence of these vapor trails. And what allows us to do that? Why are we allowed to do that? Why is the physicist allowed to claim that these particles exist, even though you can't see them? And this is where I need to switch back to my presentation. Well, we're allowed to think that the alpha particles exist because they're part of an explanation for what's going on in the cloud chamber. So we have this theory of physics that really successfully tells you when you're going to get these vapor trails, how they're going to behave, right? It makes all these brilliant, successful predictions. And alpha particles are part of that explanation, and they play an indispensable role in that explanation. And that's what justifies the physicist's belief in the existence of these alpha particles for the philosophical naturalist. And that's basically the model for thinking about how scientific inquiry works. So it's not just about what you can see in the test tube or whatever. It's about providing explanations. It's about trying to provide the best explanations that predict phenomena. And it's about understanding what's crucial or an essential ingredient in that explanation. So if that's a more accurate or a bit more of a precise picture of how scientific inquiry works, then the question for the moral naturalist isn't, oh, can you observe directly? Can you see these objective moral facts? It's going to be, oh yeah, alpha particles, 2 protons, 2 neutrons, the phenomena of the vapor trails. I should have clarified that. So the question for the moral naturalist isn't so much, oh, where are you going to find those objective moral facts? Are you going to see them in a test tube? Are you going to find them at the bottom of an archaeological dig? No. The question is, do moral facts explain? Do they play indispensable explanatory roles? Do they play indispensable roles in our best explanations of what we might call moral phenomena? And here, moral phenomena are just our engagements in moral practice, when we form moral judgments and things like that. So do moral facts explain? And at this point, it'd be nice if we had some access to some sort of test, right? As to whether something explains or something does not explain, right? And so it's a good thing that we do have such a test. And philosophers call this the counterfactual test. The name isn't too important. Counterfactual, you can just, we call it the counterfactual test because it proposes a sort of hypothetical scenario. So you can just think of it as the hypothetical test, if you like. And when we're using it to determine the relevance of a certain sort of entity or property or process to explaining some phenomena, then all we have to do is ask, would that phenomenon still be there if that thing that we're asking about, X, let's call it, wasn't there, right? Does it make a difference, essentially, as to whether the thing we're testing, X, is or is not there? And if we answer yes to this question, then X doesn't make a difference, right? It doesn't play an essential role in our explanation for that phenomena. And so we ought not to there's no justification in this context for thinking that thing exists. If the phenomena would change, if that thing wasn't present, then it does make a difference. It does play an indispensable role in our explanations. And so we have license to think that thing exists. So this probably seems a little abstract, so here's a sort of illustration to make it seem more intuitive. So once I was sort of with two friends, and they didn't know each other very well, and they were getting to know each other, and they discovered that they were both lactose intolerant, right, ordering lunch or whatever. So one of them goes, "Oh, you're lactose intolerant too? That's so cool, wow." And one of them, and this person who sort of exclaimed this, was also a diehard astrologist, really into star signs and things like that. And they paused for a moment and they said, "Oh, actually, that makes complete sense because we're both Pisces. Of course we're both lactose intolerant." And at that point, I was like, what? No, that doesn't make sense. Stop. And I got an interesting lesson on how astrology works that I think was supposed to convince me. And this actually happened, and I put this example in my thesis to talk about bad explanations. But I changed the names of the people. So you're probably getting a sense that we can apply our counterfactual test here, right? So we have someone who thinks that being Pisces is sort of relevant to our explanation of the phenomenon of lactose intolerance, right? And if we want to test its relevance, we can apply our counterfactual test. So take one of the people, let's call her Alice, right? If Alice wasn't Pisces, but all the other facts were the same, so they have the same biology, they have the same genetic profile, the same DNA and genes and all that jazz, would she still be lactose intolerant? And if you're going to answer yes to this question, then, or if we sort of arrange some kind of broad empirical test for this, right, and there proved to be no link there, then you've got no reason to think lactose intolerance is a real thing. So this is another opportunity. I want to ask you. I want you to apply the counterfactual test, right? Oh, no. So to go back to the same sort of method, scan the QR code. What do you think? If Alice wasn't Pisces, but she had the same biology and genetic profile, would she still be lactose intolerant? What are your thoughts? Adrian, feel free to, are you doing it? Yeah, good, okay. Oh, 4.76%, oh no. Oh no. Yeah, it's a good thing this is anonymous, isn't it? Okay, so there's not a lot of people who think lactose intolerance and being Pisces are, connected in some special way. Cool. Now let's apply the same counterfactual test to the alpha particle case. So what I want to ask is, if there were no alpha particles present in that fish tank in the cloud chamber, the video that you saw, but if all the other details were the same, so there's still a thorium rod or whatever, you're still, the air's still on the edge of sort of condensing into water droplets. If there were no particles being emitted, would you still see the vapor trails? I don't know if I ask these questions sort of properly or neutrally. I load the answers a bit just to point you in the direction I want you to go in. Okay. So we've got a few don't knows. That's fine because we're not theoretical physicists, right? But it seems as though a lot of us agree that, no, you wouldn't still see the vapor trails. It matters that there are alpha particles there. And so alpha particles play an indispensable role in our explanation. We need them. And the appearance of the vapor trails, the phenomena, seems to provide evidence for the existence of these vapor trails, alpha particles. Good. 2.63% of you think we'd still see them. That's fine. Now, if I can come back here. And so this is the test we want to apply to the idea of objective moral facts, right? So it's not, oh, can you see them at the bottom of the test tube? It's, do they explain and do they play an indispensable role in our explanations? So we want to think of a way to apply this counterfactual test to scrutinize the notion of objective moral facts. And that's precisely what a philosopher in the 70s did, this philosopher called Gilbert Harman. And he did so by proposing a thought experiment to do with a cat. And that thought experiment involves you witnessing a gang of children or teenagers, say, pouring gasoline on this cat in an alley and setting it on fire whilst it's alive. So it's a bit of a horrible example, but it's supposed to be horrible, right? Because Gilbert Harman doesn't want us to be distracted by a case where we're arguing, whether a certain thing is right or wrong. He's interested in why we think that thing is right or wrong in the case of the cat. So he says, if you round a corner and see a group of young hoodlums, this is very old man in the 70s language, pour gasoline on a cat and ignite it, you can see that it's wrong, right? I'm not doing the poll here. I'm going to assume that you all agree that that's wrong. But is your reaction due to the actual wrongness, right? Or in other words, is it due to your perception or intuitive picking up of some objective moral fact? Or is it simply a reflection of your moral sense, a sense that you've acquired perhaps as a result of your moral upbringing? Is it just down to your feelings or your sentiments, perhaps? So that's what Gilbert Harman wants to know. And so let's think about this. Let's do the counterfactual test. If there were no objective moral facts, whatever form they might take, right, God's will or whatever the naturalist thinks they are, right, if they just didn't exist, but you happened upon this scenario where you've got a bunch of hoodlums pouring gasoline on a cat, setting it on fire, let's say they're laughing while they do it, and the cat's screaming in agony, are you still going to think that's wrong, that's a bad thing they're doing? Again, I'm not doing a poll here, because I would hope the answer seems obvious, right? Presumably, yes. You'd still think it's wrong. And this is exactly the conclusion that Gilbert Harman arrives at. So he says, the fact that you made a particular moral observation when you did does not seem to be evidence about, or is not explained by, moral facts. It's only evidence about you and your moral sensibility. Of course, we'd still judge what those kids are doing to be wrong, because that's just how we respond when we see a poor little innocent cat being burned alive and screaming in agony. Again, it's supposed to be a horrible example. So there's a bit of an irony here, right? We had this initial objection to the idea of moral naturalism along the lines of, oh yeah, well, where are these moral facts? Can you see them? Can you touch them? And we said, no, that's not how we should think about whether, that's not how we should judge whether or not moral facts exist, right? We should understand scientific inquiry more accurately. It's about explanations, and so we should ask about their explanatory role, and we should judge moral naturalism according to this counterfactual test. But the irony is that it seems like it's failing this test now. So that's not very good for the moral naturalist. And quite naturally, you might think the naturalist is going to want to respond here, and they're going to want to say, actually, we're doing the test wrong. We're getting the details of the counterfactual test wrong. So they're going to want to push back against this conclusion. And to see how the naturalist thinks we're getting this test wrong, we need to look very briefly in a bit more detail about how the naturalist, or the sort of naturalist that I'm talking about, understands the relationship between moral facts and physical phenomena. And this is for you, Adrian. So Adrian's a die-hard Manchester City supporter, so this is entirely for Adrian. So according to the naturalist, the relation between moral facts and physical phenomena is much like the relationship between a football team and the people who make up that football team. So in a sense, there's clearly a sort of close relationship between those things, but there's a sense in which they're not the same thing, right? There's a sense in which they're two quite different things. And you might sort of illustrate that difference by recognizing certain properties or certain features that the team might have that none of its players might have, and vice versa, right? So the team probably has a really long extended record of wins and losses that probably none of its players share, right? Because the team's probably older than all the players on the team. Likewise, you might have a player, a new addition maybe, or something, who's really, really popular. But judging from your reaction when I put this on the screen, it might not be a popular team at all. This relationship is something that philosophers call supervenience, if you're interested in the technicality. And it basically means that to have the team, you need to have the people, and you can't have a change in the team without having a change in the people, or the stadium, or the infrastructure, or the management system, or something like that. And actually, really importantly, it's really weird to try to think of a scenario in which you don't have the team, but everything else is still the same, right? Imagine trying to imagine a world that's exactly the same as ours, and there's still the people on the team, and there's still the stadium, and still the management structure, and still the